So we're doing the series on doubt right now, and it's intentionally named Wrestling with Doubt, Finding Faith. You know, we have such a tendency to think of doubt about God, about faith, about religion, about the things that are bigger than us. We think of it as a doubt as a bad thing, as something that we should feel guilty about or ashamed of. But the truth is, doubt leads us to a deeper faith. Doubt saves us from beliefs that might be off base, and doubt helps us to believe for ourselves, not just because of what we've been told. And so doubt is a good thing. And in this series, we're asking the questions that many people wrestle with, such as, is there a God? Is the Bible true? Those were the first 2 weeks of the series. And if you missed them and it interests you, I hope you'll go back and pick them up on our website or podcast or anywhere that we have them, because I know this is one of those series that's been speaking to me in my heart too, and making me face some of my own doubts in a very good and healthy way. But today's question, I believe, might just be the biggest theological question of our generation. Are all Christians going to hell? Now, the reason I think this is the biggest question for our generation is because we're the first generation to have travel and communication so widely available to us. 100 years ago, that was foolish. You didn't have to ask the question about other Christians because you might never encounter somebody who wasn't a Christian. You couldn't go on the internet 100 years ago and read something written by or watch a video from or have a conversation with someone from a different religion. Yet even me, now officially a middle-aged man, when I went to high school, I was surrounded by people who were from other countries from around the world, certainly at college, and that's gotten only more true since then. I mentioned that class I'm teaching right now, right? And so all of us are faced with that question of what do we make of other religions in a way that previous generations didn't have to ask. They could spend their time on other questions. Now, to me, the question, are all Christians going to hell, is actually two questions wrapped up in one. So, I do hope you have your seatbelts on. There is a lot to talk about today, and I'm going to spend the first half of our time talking about how we relate to other religions and where is God in that question, and then the second half of the sermon talking about hell, because I think that's honestly kind of a separate question that we need to talk about. And I hope it will challenge some of you, and I hope it will give some of you reasons to doubt anew in the good, best sense of the word doubt. Now, there's a metaphor that I think is going to help us with both of those questions, and that is a phoropter. Does anybody know what a phoropter is? I'll bet almost every single, not a single hand, maybe some of you is thinking it inside. I'll admit I've used them many times, but I did not know what they were called until I was preparing this sermon. This is a phoropter. It's the thing at the optometrist, at the eye doctor, that you look through, and it has all the lenses. And I will admit, I am fascinated by these things. Like, I wish I had an optometrist friend who would let me go in and play with the phoropter and all those lenses. I think because it sounds like fun to me. So, just to be sure we're all on the same page, and just to set things up, especially if any of you aren't familiar with it. And Molly, let's just leave that picture up for the entire rest of the sermon here. I'm going to keep referring back to it. So, the two holes in the middle are what you look through when you're at the eye doctor. You'd be sitting on the far side of it, and then the optometrist starts putting different lenses in front of your eyes, and you look across the room at an eye chart, which is a certain number of feet away, and all this is, I'm sure they've done studies as to the best way to do that. And if it's your first time to the eye doctor, chances are the first set of lenses he puts on there are going to be worse. So you try to look at that E, and it looks blurry, right? And you try to see what's the lowest line on the eye chart that you can read. And then, I'm guessing many of you know the drill here. The optometrist says, is 1 the better, or flip 2? 1 or 2. And usually, one of them is way clearer than the other. So maybe let's just say it's 2. Then he goes 2 or, and then he flips another doohickey on it, or 3. 2 or 3. And as you go through the process, the eye chart starts to get clearer and clearer and clearer until you can read that bottom line, and then you know the prescription you need for your glasses. That's what a phoropter is, and it's quite the invention. One of the eye doctors I had, my current one doesn't do this, but the last one did, where he at one point said, when I finally get to the one where I can't tell the difference between the two, he finally says, but it looks worse when I do this. And then you do that, right? And I also have to say that I've always prided myself in being able to rattle off that last line on the eye chart, but here I am at 46 and I'm finding it's more difficult. Like the last couple times I was at the optometrist, I tried to read that bottom line and I'm like, is that a C or a G? What? And I try to be all confident and just see and, hope I'm right. And so far I have been. But I can tell that as my eyes age, we're not quite able to get it as perfect as we were when I was younger. Now, that is what I think is the starting point for our conversation today, both about other religions and about heaven and hell. The lack of focus. Because the truth is, when it comes to these big nebulous questions, these questions that are so far beyond what we can possibly know, these questions about the infinite, these questions about what's on the other side of death in the case of heaven and hell, these are things that none of us can see perfectly. So I think that has to be our starting point, is a recognition that we aren't going to be able to see it. When it comes to God is love, when it comes to the loving, grace-filled nature of God, that's the big E. We can see that pretty clearly and we can read it. We know that God is love. When it comes to the fact that God calls us to love other people and our neighbors, that's the F and the P. These are the greatest commandments, by the way, that Jesus said, right? Those are the clearest things that can be. But when it comes to talking about heaven and hell and other religions and what happens after we die, well, we're down there on line 11, aren't we? And I think we have to acknowledge that, and whatever we say today, hold it lightly. And if I challenge anything in a belief that you hold dear today, which I just might, I'm going to try to, let's both try to hold it lightly, because I think that's part of it. And in fact, it's even quite biblical, because Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, the famous love passage, love is gentle, love is kind. At the end of that, he says, "For now we see as in a mirror darkly." In other words, everything looks a little blurry. We can't see things now the way we'll be able to see them one day in the way God sees them. Or, to summarize Paul in modern language, the best we can do is to look at God as if we weren't wearing our glasses. Some things we can see clearly, others not so much. Okay. So let's talk about other religions. And I think a little bit of history helps me understand. So archaeologists managed to discover fantastic things. They find ancestors of human beings going back incredibly far, whether that be artwork on the wall of a cave, whether it be jewelry or tools or things like that. But archaeologists tell us that somewhere between 35,000 years ago and 65,000 years ago, they began to find burial sites that had ceremonial artifacts. In other words, evidence that these early human beings began to realize that there was something more going on with death. You can see it in the kind of artifacts that they found. Even evidence that they began to believe that there was something on the other side of death. Now, we're talking 35 to 65,000 years ago. Let's just pick a number in the middle, 50,000. Where was God, I ask you, with these human beings 50,000 years ago that were beginning to see that there was something on the other side of death, that there was more going on than they could understand? Where was God with them? Well, it seems to me, as best we can possibly know 50,000 years later, that God was content to let them figure it out. That even though their understanding was very basic, or I'm going to guess, in some cases flat out wrong, that God was willing to stand beside them as they began to figure it out. Or another way to look at it is as a parent. There have been times when my kids have been doing their homework and I've wanted to just tell them the answer. Any other parents want to just say, the answer is 7. Write down 7 and let's move on. Like a big part of you wants to do that. And sometimes it's frustration, but sometimes it's just seeing how badly they're struggling and how much they want the answer and how much it's on the tip of their tongue, you want to just give it to them. But is that what your child needs when they're doing their homework? No, of course not. What they need is the wrestling match. What they need is the struggle. What they need is the work they're doing in here to find the answer on their own, because that's how they'll be able to go to the next step after it. And if you just give them the answer, they'll never learn to walk on their own. I say mixing my parenting metaphors, but you get the idea, right? You see, that's how I would describe God with the people 50,000 years ago, at least as best we can see from this far in the future. That they were figuring it out. They were learning to walk one step at a time. And God wasn't going to just give them the answer because they needed to figure it out on their own. Or, in terms of the Pharopter, they knew there were letters there, but they started with a blurry lens that wasn't anywhere close to the prescription yet. But century after century, millennium after millennium, is one the better or two or three? And over time, their view of God began to be a little more clear. Now, recorded history came only a few thousand years ago. That's when our Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, came into the picture, and writing was developed, and we have so much more of a record. Now, last week we talked about the parts of the Bible that are flat out wrong in some cases. Now, wrong in a way that reflects where the people were at the time, and wrong in such a way that it can teach us. So right in another sense, of course, but we have to understand how it came to be and how it developed. But you can even see as you go through the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, people saying, what is the clearest view of God? Is it one or two? Is it two or three? Is it three or four? As that picture began to come into focus. And every now and then, the great optometrist puts a lens in front of their eyes that makes them say, oh, that's not right. And they take a step backwards and have to do some of the work over again. And that's how we have the development of religion as we know it today. But it didn't just happen in one place. Because as I said earlier, and as we all know, airplanes and the internet didn't develop until much, much later. No, we have human beings all over the earth that are all looking at this eye chart, trying to figure out what's going on, trying to figure out who God is. God is sitting beside them every step of the way, but we all figured it out a little bit differently. And so every religion, I believe, started to see the divine through their own lens. And perhaps you could even say that each culture needed a little bit different lens, a little bit different prescription that was the clearest view of God for them. And much of what the different religions have come up with agree with one another in remarkable ways. Studying the common threads between different religions is a fascinating thing to do. But let's be honest. Sometimes that C on the bottom line looks an awful lot like a G. Sometimes the F looks an awful lot like an E. Then, about 2,000 years ago, Jesus came. Now, as Christians, we believe that Jesus was God with skin on. That it was God saying, finally, that you've done so much wrestling on your own, I'm going to help you with this one little bit. And comes to us not only to walk with us, but comes in a backwoods corner of the poorest of people as a vulnerable infant. He said so many things that we know instantly just feel right to us and we know is the truth. Like shunning the powers of this world. Instead, he spent his time with those who were most deemed outcasts. God became our ruler, not our friend. And in time, he gave his life, entering into our pain and suffering, and overcame death itself. And for me, it's in reading the stories of Jesus, it's in getting to know Jesus, that for me, the Pharopter clicks into the clearest view possible. To me, what we see in Jesus is the clearest view of God that I have ever found anywhere, and that's why I call myself Christian. But does that mean every other religion in the world is wrong? I don't believe so. Now, first, let me acknowledge that a Muslim would say that to them, Islam is the clearest view. To a Jew, they would say that Judaism is. But even standing where I stand, it doesn't mean that everybody else is wrong. It's more like we're looking through a different set of lenses because we've arrived at our view of God in a different way, through a different route. Now, I do want to say that I'm going to stop short of saying one thing you sometimes hear, that all religions lead to the same thing. Because let's be honest, there are some dangerous beliefs out there. And it's important to be careful and not to trust, but instead to ask yourself, is this a clearer view of God? Perhaps that's why God gifted us with doubt. But while I cannot speak for God, I also can't imagine that God doesn't still look at us like a parent as we try to figure it out. I'm going to stretch this metaphor just a little bit too far. First, we had to struggle with long division on our own. We had to figure it out on our own, even though it was difficult. And God knew that just giving us the answer wouldn't help. But when we got to the point where we could do it on our own, God gave us a calculator in Jesus. And all of a sudden, everything started to seem a little bit simpler. All of a sudden, we had such a clear view of God. But God is still bigger than our brains to hold. So even with the calculator, is there any surprise calculus is still hard? Yeah, okay, I'm pushing the metaphor a little far, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say. I'd also like to say that I believe we need other religions. Just because I believe that Jesus is the clearest view of God, my eyes aren't perfect, and I can't see perfectly even with the clearest lens. And so I need people using other lenses to help me see what I can't, and to help me see part of God that I can't. That's my belief anyway. Okay, so like I said, this is a lot for one sermon. But there is at least what I believe, what I have found to be a grace-filled, God-like view of other religions. But let's talk a little more about that question of hell and about heaven and the afterlife. Now, what I'm going to say here may challenge some of you, especially depending on how you're raised, and I want to say straight out that you don't have to agree with me. On this part especially, I'm sharing with you what I've found. I'm sharing with you where my doubt has led me. What it's really about is for you to be on the journey yourself and to come up with your own answer. But I've shared this before in some places, but I've come to the point where I don't believe in hell. At least not as it's popularly presented. We have this image of hell as a fiery place of eternal damnation. And that's what I've come to reject. And I'm not the only one. There are a number of books out there, and if any of you are interested in going deeper, drop me a note or something, and I'm happy to give you a reading list. The first one I ever encountered was back in the 90s, a book called If Grace is True. And the title kind of says it all. What it's saying is that if God's grace is true, then it has to be really true. If God's love is infinite, then it truly has to be infinite. Why do we draw this divide that says that God's grace may be infinite, but that he would make some people suffer in eternal damnation? Right? That doesn't make sense. If God's grace is true, it has to be true all the way, because that's what love is. When I was in seminary, I started studying and learned that many of the passages in the Bible that sound like they're talking about eternal damnation are not nearly as straightforward as they seem. And when you actually dig into them, there's nuance. Since then, I've learned so much about mental health and trauma and abuse and these types of things in our society. Let me give you an example. What if somebody rejects Jesus because they were abused by someone in the church? Is God going to condemn them to eternal torture because of it? No. Who could love a God like that? If grace is true, it has to be absolutely true. No, for me, this is an exercise of healthy doubt. It's an exercise where my own doubt led me to what I believe to be a more robust picture of what life happens after death. Now, let's stop here, because I don't know what happens after death. I can't answer what does happen. What I am increasingly sure of my own self is that it's at least not that. The truth is, death and what happens after is where the phoropter gets really blurry. Imagine going to the optometrist and they took one of those instruction manuals that comes with electronics that you buy off of Amazon, and they held that up beneath line 11. Could you read it? No. The truth is, none of us know what happens after death. But if we look through the lens of Jesus, what do we see? If we look through the lens of Jesus, we see Jesus and Lazarus, the friend of his whom he raised from the grave while he was on earth. It shows us that Jesus has power over death. Then there's the cross, when Jesus was crucified and died. And in that, looking through the lens of Jesus, we see that even God himself entered into death. And then, of course, there's the resurrection. There's Easter. The stories of Jesus appearing to his disciples even after he had died. We see that Jesus even had a physical body. Thomas, the doubter, with his healthy doubt, said he wouldn't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead unless he could touch him himself. And so what did Jesus do? He said, "Here, look, the wound is still in my hand. Touch it." Or the time that Jesus appeared on the beach and ate fish with his disciple. And as I love saying, it's not like a cartoon skeleton where they drink a glass of water and it goes down all the bones. No, Jesus sat with his disciples, having raised from the dead, and ate fish with his disciple. So we know that we look through the lens of Jesus, we see that Jesus has power over death. We see that Jesus entered into death. And we see that he overcame death. That's what the lens of Jesus shows us. Jesus came back physically, as I said, and said that it would be true for us, too. For me, so much of faith comes back to that passage we read in Revelation, the second passage we read earlier. Let me read it for you again. It goes on longer than what we read, but let me read the first bit. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, "Look, God's dwelling is here with humankind. He will dwell with them, and they will be his peoples. God himself will be with them as their God." You know, I'm going to get into one of the weirder corners of Christian theology here. But one of my favorite theologians is a biblical theologian. Like, he tries to figure out what exactly did the biblical writers believe, and what exactly did they believe in those first days after Jesus. And he says that it's as clear as anything that they believed that heaven wasn't the place we go for eternity, that heaven was more like a hotel. It was more like a place where we stay until the day comes that we are all raised like Jesus. Now, to a scientific mind, that's pretty weird, I'll admit. But it's what Christians have believed for 2,000 years. It's in our creeds. When we say the resurrection of the body, that's what we mean. Now, admittedly, we're on the bottom line of that eye chart, and things are pretty blurry, and we cannot know for sure, so we hold it lightly. But I think in the meantime, we lean into the part that says made ready. We lean into the part that says that we have a job here and now to get things ready, to be peacemakers, to be justice bringers, to make this world more like God's kingdom, to shape this world so that when that day comes that all is complete, that Eden is restored, to bring in both Jewish and Christian imagery, that when that day comes, we're ready to bring together the people of the world, to look each through our own lenses so that together we can see even more, and to reflect God's goodness into the world so that the earth is ready to be the home of God fully. So, will people of other religions go to hell? My healthy doubt has taught me that that's the wrong question to ask. I think a better way to look at it is like this, and this is a metaphor from that same theologian, N.T. Wright, the cathedral builder. You ever think about all those Middle Ages, those Gothic cathedrals, how many stones they were with the building techniques of the days? They didn't have the same kind of cranes that we have. They can't pop up a building in the middle of suburbia almost overnight, as it seems. No, it took multiple lifetimes to build those cathedrals. And I could only imagine some of those builders who would have been a lot less educated than you or I laying their stone. And if it had been me, I would have looked at some of those other builders and think, well, that's weird. Why are they putting a stone there? Well, that's a funny shaped little outcropping. What's that all about? That's the kind of builder I would have been. Not complaining about what others were doing, or maybe even the instructions that I was given. It's like, well, why do they want a wall here? This doesn't make sense to put a wall over here like this. But the truth is, we are not the architects. We are not the architects. We can't see the big picture of what is being built in our midst. All we can do is trust the plan and to trust the drawings that we've been given, to look as clearly as we can and to at least try to appreciate what that plan, what the great architect has in mind. And so whenever we're kind to one another, we lay another brick in the cathedral. Whenever we act as a peacemaker, we lay another brick in the cathedral. Whenever we make this world more like God's intends through an act of justice, we lay another brick in the cathedral. Whenever we pray, we lay another brick. Whenever we find God in silence, we lay another brick. Whenever we appreciate beauty in music or in art, whenever we create poetry or bring beauty into the world our own selves, we lay another brick in the cathedral. And with each brick you lay, and with each brick of other people that you learn to appreciate, you may just find your view of the cathedral coming more and more into focus. Would you pray with me? Oh God, thank you for the phoropter. Because of it, we are able to see one another more clearly. But thank you even more so for all the views you give us of you and of what you're doing in this world. Thank you for Jesus, who helps us to see you so much more clearly. But thank you for those who use different lenses as well. Share with us your grace, not only because we need it our own selves, but also so that it might help us to appreciate the bricks that everyone lays in your great cathedral. Help us now to do our part of it well. May this week be one where we lay an especial number of bricks. We pray it in your holy name. Amen.